Okay, so we're going to jump into our JavaScript now and start on the validation. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to do it in a very simple way first. And it's basically just going to be a bunch of if statements, checking the fields, and then showing the errors. And then after that, I'm going to completely refactor it to make it much cleaner so that if we were to add more fields, we wouldn't have to keep adding if statements and so on. Basically, I'm going to put all of the validations into their own functions. So for instance, to check required, to check the length, check if the email is valid, we'll have these separate functions for the validations rather than just a bunch of if statements. So the code in this video is going to be completely refactored in the next video, but I do want to just show you kind of a simple, easy way to do it. So the first thing we want to do is pull in all the DOM elements that we need. So we need the form itself, and then we need each of these inputs because we need to grab the text that's typed in. So let's go up here and let's say const form. Okay, so I'm going to define a variable here, and I'm going to use the document object, which has a method called getElementById. And again, I know a lot of you guys know this stuff, but I'm just explaining it because this is kind of the intro project. So the form has an ID of form, so I'm grabbing it this way. I could just as well use something like query selector, and I could put in either the form tag or a class or anything at all, but I like to use getElementById and use IDs when I'm pulling something from the DOM. So we have the form. Now I'm going to have 4 more of these, and we want to get each field. So we have the username, because if you remember, we have the form has an ID of form, and then each input has an ID of whatever that field is, username, email, and so on. So we want to grab all of those. So we have email, we have password, password2. You just want to change these variables. Okay, so that'll bring in everything from the DOM. Now we need to add an event listener on this form for when we submit it. So let's take the form element and let's add an event listener. So this add event listener will take in 2 things. First is the event we want to listen for, which is a submit. Okay, so we're listening for a submit on this form, and then we're going to run a function. And this function takes in an event parameter that has a whole bunch of properties and methods and stuff that we can use. Now, if I just do a console log here, and let's just say submit, and we go over here, we open our console with Command Option I or F12 on Windows, and we submit. You can see down here it does show the submit, but then it goes away. It just flashes. And that's because the form is doing what it's supposed to do. It's just submitting to this file, which we don't want. We want to kind of intercept it. So that event parameter that we passed in, that e value, has a method called preventDefault, which prevents it from actually submitting. So now if I click, it just shows submit and it doesn't flash. It doesn't actually submit the form. Okay, we're basically taking over within our JavaScript. So from here, let's get rid of that. Actually, let's console log username and see what we get. So if I just type something in here and I submit, we don't get the text, we get the actual element, which is the input. And we don't want that. We want just the value. So when you have an input like this, there's a value property. So we can just put in .value, and then if I type something in, submit, then we can see the value. So knowing that, let's just create some if statements here. Let's just do the username for now. So we'll say if username.value is equal to nothing, then we know that there's nothing there, and we need to show the error. So I mean, you could do something like alert, and then username is required, something like that. So if I were to submit now, we get an alert, but that's really ugly looking. We don't want that. We want to show the error down here, so we have to do some stuff with the DOM. So instead of an alert, we're actually going to have a function called showError, and that's going to take in 2 things. It's going to take in the actual input, or the element, which is the username, and then it's going to take the message, so we can actually keep that there. And then I'm just going to have an else and then have a show success, and that will take in whatever the input is as well, in this case username, and I just want to have a green outline around it if it's successful. Okay, ultimately you would just submit the form, but we don't actually have a back end to submit to. So now for these functions, let's create these. I usually like to have my event listeners down below, and this is kind of the structure we'll follow throughout the course is the event listeners down below and then the functions up here. So let's say show error, and let's actually put a comment here. We'll just say show input error message, and this takes in whatever the input is and then the message. And there's basically two things that I want to happen. I want to outline the input with red. So remember, we have an error class in our CSS, which is, let's see, so right here, if the form control div has an error class attached to it, then the input will have a border color of the red color, which we put in a variable custom property. So we actually have to deal with the form control div, which is a parent, because we have the input, but we want to add the error class onto this div. So we need to somehow get to this. So in here, let's create a variable called form control, and we can get to that by taking whatever the input is, in this case the username, we're passing in down here, and there's a property that we can use, a JavaScript, just vanilla JavaScript, called parent element, and that will get just that, whatever the parent is. And if we look at our HTML, this input's parent is this div. It's not this label. These are on the same level. These are siblings in the DOM. This is the parent, and then this is the child. So we want to get the parent element, which is this form control div. So once we get that, let's take that form control and let's manipulate the class name. Okay, now this class name property, we can basically what we're doing is overriding the class for this element here. And now we need to have this form control class, so let's make sure that we have that in there. But then I also want to add the error class, which makes the border of the input red. So I'm going to save this, and now if I try to submit without entering anything, two things happen. I get my outline here, and then this also shows, because in our CSS we have this, where is it? Right here. If the form control div has an error class, then the small is going to be visible. Okay, it's hidden by default, but if we have that error class, then the small tag is going to be visible, and that's what we're seeing here. Now obviously we don't want to just show the text error message, we want to show whatever our actual message is. So to do that, let's take our let's go down here, let's create a new variable for the small tag, or the small element, and we can get that by using the current form control, and we can run query selector on that. Oops. Okay, so if we say form control query selector, and we want to select the small tag. So query selector can take in a tag itself, it can take in a class, an ID, whatever. We want the small within that form control. And then we're simply going to take that small and we're going to change the inner text. We don't want it to show error message, we want it to show our message that's passed in here, which is being passed in here. So let's save that, and now if I submit, we get username is required. Okay, so we have a nice little function to display the error message right under the input and outline that. Now for the success, let's say show success outline. We're just going to function show success, which is going to take in the input, and we're basically going to do the same thing we did with these two lines. We're going to get the form control, and then we're going to just set a success class instead of an error class. So if I were to type something in here and submit, now it's green because it passed. Okay, it passed this right here. It's not empty. So we ran show success, passed the username in. Username got passed in. We got the form control for that particular input. And then we set the class name to success, which made this green outline because in our CSS, we have this right here. Okay, so this is why I didn't want to make this course just JavaScript, like just here, paste in the CSS and then we'll just do the JavaScript, because the CSS and JavaScript they're closely related, right? So most of this stuff you'll see we have transitions and we need to add and remove certain classes, and I want you to get the whole picture rather than just typing out the JavaScript and not paying attention to the HTML or the CSS. Now, for the rest of these fields, the way we're doing it here, we have to basically do this for every field. So if we wanted to do the email, we would have to change that to email. Email is required. So now if I submit and I don't enter the email, same thing. I'm going to change this after because this really isn't the best way to do this. Say password, and we'll do password 2. So now we have the required on all of them. Now let's say we wanted to make sure that the email is valid, because right now I could put in whatever and the email is fine. So what I'll do here is create a function up here, and we'll say function is valid email, which will take in an email. And the way that we do this is with a regular expression. So I'm just going to head over to, actually I'm just going to search Google right here, and I'm going to say JS, so JavaScript email regex. And this right here is the link I want, this Stack Overflow link. And I mean, there's so many different expressions and ways to do this. I'm going to grab this one here. So we already have our function. I'm just going to grab this. And let's paste that in here. I'm just going to use const instead of var. So this regular expression, what's wrapped in these forward slashes, is a regular expression that matches an email address. And then down here, and we're putting into a variable called RE. And then we're running the test method, which will take in whatever we want to pass in to see if it matches. And if it does, it will return true. If it doesn't, it will return false. And we're just making sure it's a string, and we're just making it lowercase when we pass it in. So this is valid email. What we could do now is go down here, and where we check the email value, we could put in, we could put in an else if, and we could say if email dot value, actually let's say is valid email, which is our function, and then we want to pass in email dot value. And we want to actually check if it's not, so we're going to put a exclamation there. So if it's not valid, then let's show an error, except let's change the message to email is not valid. So we'll save that, and we'll go over here and we'll just enter in some letters here and submit. We get email is not valid. Okay, if I don't have anything, we get email is required. If I put in a valid email that matches the regular expression, it works. Okay, so this is kind of I guess the really easy and self-explanatory way to do it, is just to take each field and have some if statements on the value. But in the next video, what I'd like to do is just create some functions that we can use, and we can just pass fields into them rather than checking each value and having else ifs and stuff like that. All right, so we'll do that. We'll refactor this in the next video.